Hello, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. I'm really glad you made it here tonight. Wherever you are on this planet, this little pocket of quiet was made just for you. A calm space where science and stillness can sit side by side. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly into one of Earth's most haunting and beautiful stories. A story about endings and beginnings. Because long before humans ever walked under the stars, long before even the first dinosaurs took cautious steps across a steaming green world, life had already been nearly wiped out. Not once, but 5 times. These weren't slow fades, they were sudden, devastating moments when entire species vanished, oceans emptied, forests turned to ash, and even the sky itself changed color. We call them mass extinctions, and somehow, every time, life found a way back. Tonight, we'll explore why these catastrophes happened, what Earth was really like during those collapses, and most importantly, how anything managed to survive them. We'll meet the tiny, overlooked creatures that slipped through the cracks, the hidden survivors that endured, even when nearly everything else was gone. If you're already enjoying this peaceful moment, it would mean the world to me if you gave this video a gentle like, maybe even subscribed if you'd like more sleepy science stories like this. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight and what time is it there? I love watching our little bedtime map light up, one dreamer at a time. So now, take a breath, let your shoulders soften, and let's begin. So, what exactly is a mass extinction? It's not just a bad day for a few unlucky species. It's a collapse, a sweeping planet-wide event where at least 75% of all known life forms vanish, not over millions of years, but often in a relatively short geological blink. Suddenly, the diversity of life, all the forms, colors, and sounds that fill an era, is cut down. Whole branches of the evolutionary tree are snapped off at once, leaving only broken stumps behind. But extinction, in itself, is nothing unusual. It's always happening, quietly in the background. In fact, scientists call that the background extinction rate, the natural rhythm of species appearing and disappearing as ecosystems shift, predators evolve, and climates drift. Under normal conditions, a few species go extinct every 1,000 years. That's the background, but a mass extinction isn't part of that background hum. It's a siren, sudden, loud, and catastrophic. To understand when one of these massive die-offs has happened, scientists don't look at clocks, they look at rocks. Fossils, buried in layers of sediment, are nature's time-stamped memories. Each layer tells a story of who lived, who died, and when the world around them began to change. In some layers, the fossils are rich and varied: coral reefs, trilobites, flowering plants, insects, amphibians, all jumbled together in a vibrant museum of life. Then, above that layer, there's silence, a sharp drop in variety. Maybe just one or two species show up, maybe none. That sharp boundary, like turning a colorful page to find the next one nearly blank, is what tells scientists that a mass extinction has occurred. And it's not just fossils. Scientists also study isotopes, tiny chemical clues hidden in ancient rocks. A spike in certain elements, like iridium, can hint at an asteroid impact. Changes in carbon or oxygen isotopes can signal warming oceans, toxic algae blooms, or volcanic outbursts that change the atmosphere. All of these signals come together like pieces of a puzzle, clues that tell us Earth didn't just lose a few animals, it lost nearly everything. So far, we know of 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history. The first was during the Ordovician period, when much of life was still in the sea. A sudden cold snap, followed by rapidly falling sea levels, wiped out most marine species. Next came the Devonian extinction, which crept in slowly, killing off ancient fish and reef systems, the world's early aquatic architects. Then, the worst one of all, the Permian-Triassic extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying. It nearly erased life itself, taking out more than 90% of marine species and 70% of those on land. After that, the Triassic extinction opened the door for the dinosaurs to rise, clearing away older reptile lineages and reshaping the land. And finally, the most famous of all, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, marked by the end of the dinosaurs, a fireball from space, and then silence. Some scientists believe we're in the early stages of a sixth mass extinction right now, not because of asteroids or volcanoes, but because of habitat destruction, climate change, and the pressures humans are placing on ecosystems. But that's something we'll return to later in our journey. For now, what's most important to know is that these mass extinctions weren't just moments of destruction, they were turning points, full stops in Earth's story that forced a new sentence to begin. Because every time life was cut down, what returned looked different. Sometimes we imagine extinction as a failure, as a species that lost the game or couldn't keep up. But looked at another way, it's something else entirely, a reset, a realignment, a reshaping of what life can be. Mass extinctions cleared the slate, yes, but they also made room for forests to grow where seas once were, for mammals to rise from the shadows, for wings to form and flowers to bloom, and brains to imagine bedtime stories like this one. And so the earth turns the page, not because life is over, but because something new is about to begin. If we want to understand how life nearly disappeared from Earth, we have to learn to read the stories the planet has left behind, not written in ink, not carved in words, but pressed gently into stone, layer by layer, over millions of years. Geology is often described as the Earth's diary, a quiet, durable memory that holds everything: the births, the disasters, the recoveries, even when the details above ground have long vanished. And like any diary, it's not always easy to interpret at first glance. You have to know what to look for. You have to listen with your eyes. Sedimentary rocks, the ones that form from compressed mud, silt, and sand, are the pages of that diary. They pile up over time, each layer preserving a snapshot of what the world was like when it formed: a shoreline, a seabed, a forest floor. Sometimes they capture tiny shells, ancient pollen, or bones of long lost creatures. Sometimes they hold nothing at all, a quiet space where something should have been, but isn't. These layers stretch across valleys and mountains, sometimes tilted by tectonic movement, sometimes buried under cities. But even when hidden, they're still there, waiting to be read. And when scientists want to understand extinction, this is where they begin. They start by slicing down through time, studying cross sections of the Earth that reach hundreds of millions of years into the past. They look for sudden shifts, a rich layer filled with fossilized life, followed by a band that is strangely empty. The fossils don't slowly fade away, they stop abruptly. That absence speaks louder than any preserved bone, and it isn't just what's missing that matters, it's what's still there. Certain minerals and chemical traces stay behind long after the life itself has vanished. Carbon isotopes, for example, act like bookmarks in the rock. When life is abundant and healthy, the balance of carbon 12 and carbon 13 looks one way. When massive die-offs happen, when photosynthesis stalls, when oceans go still, that balance shifts. It leaves a signature, a chemical fingerprint of collapse. Other clues are hidden in the colors and composition of the rocks themselves. A layer rich in iridium, a rare metal more common in asteroids than on Earth, can point to an impact event. Layers of black shale suggest stagnant, oxygen-poor seas. Volcanic ash bands, rich in sulfur or mercury, hinted eruptions so vast they changed the sky. All of these signs build a timeline, not just of what happened, but when. From the deep ocean sediments of the Ordovician period, nearly 450 million years ago, to the tangled coal swamps of the Carboniferous, to the sun-drenched, dinosaur-rich layers of the Cretaceous. Geologic time isn't measured in minutes or days. It's measured in strata, in sediment, in silence, because silence in geology is never just nothing. It's a space where life used to be and then wasn't. It's where an entire forest once stood, now reduced to a smear of clay. It's where a coral reef once thrived, now replaced by a dull gray line. And when these silences happen not just once, but again and again, across different continents, in different types of rock, they start to form a pattern. Scientists call it extinction rhythm, sudden drops in biodiversity, followed by pulses of strange new forms, then long quiet periods, and eventually another drop. Not a perfect cycle, not clockwork, but a rhythm nonetheless. Each pulse marks a moment when Earth changed its mind about what kinds of life it would allow to flourish. Some changes came slow and subtle, others hit like a lightning strike, but all of them are recorded here, deep below the surface, waiting to be pieced together. And as we follow these layers upward into more recent ages, we begin to see how each extinction didn't just end a chapter, it set the stage for something entirely new to take its place. To find the beginning of Earth's great extinctions, we have to travel far back, not just in time, but in imagination. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a very different world. There's no grass beneath your feet, no trees overhead, no birds in the sky. The land is mostly bare rock and silent winds. The air carries strange gases, and the surface, though shaped like our planet, feels foreign. But just below the waves, that's where the real world of the time was thriving. It's the Ordovician period, around 444 million years ago. Earth's life is almost entirely oceanic. Shallow, warm seas cover much of the surface, lapping gently over low-lying continents. The water is clear and teeming with life. Coral reefs stretch like underwater cities, bustling with strange creatures. Trilobites, armored, multi-eyed scavengers, scurry along the seafloor. Nautiloid cephalopods float like elegant torpedoes through the water, their shells coiled tight in perfect spirals. Brachiopods, bryozoans, early crinoids, soft-bodied, shelled or tentacled, fill every niche of this marine world. And then something begins to change. It starts far away, not in the oceans, but at the edges of the atmosphere. Temperatures begin to drop, slowly at first, but then with growing intensity. Glaciers, vast and silent, begin to spread across the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. Ice forms at the poles and creeps outward, covering land that had once absorbed sunlight and warmth. With that glaciation comes a powerful side effect: sea levels fall. The water that once bathed the continents is pulled into the ice sheets, and the shallow seas, the very cradle of life at that time, begin to disappear. For marine species, this is catastrophic. These weren't deep ocean creatures. They were reef dwellers, shelf walkers, lagoon swimmers, life forms adapted to sunlit, stable, coastal waters. And now those waters are draining away. As sea levels drop, oxygen levels in the oceans shift, temperatures fluctuate, entire habitats vanish in what would have felt, on a geologic scale, like the tide going out and never coming back. But the falling water wasn't the only thing changing. Plate tectonics, the slow grinding of Earth's crust, was also reshaping the planet. Continents were on the move, drifting toward the equator or into colder regions. This movement disrupted ocean currents and weather patterns, adding chaos to an already unstable climate. And as land masses collided or broke apart, Mountain ranges formed, creating new landscapes and further altering the planet's energy balance. Together, these forces created a chain reaction that life couldn't escape. Temperature, chemistry, salinity, everything the marine biosphere relied on began to shift. By the time the extinction had finished its course, nearly 85% of all marine species were gone. Coral reefs collapsed, trilobite populations plummeted, entire lineages of brachiopods and graptolites, creatures that had dominated the oceans, disappeared almost entirely. The ocean floor, once buzzing with color and motion, quieted. The silence in the fossil record from this time isn't just an absence, it's a wound still visible in stone. And yet, not all was lost. Because even during this great unmaking, some organisms endured, tucked into deeper waters, adapted to colder temperatures, or simply lucky enough to ride out the storm. But those stories of survival are still forming quietly below the ice, waiting for what comes next. As the glaciers expand and the oceans retreat, something else is stirring just below the surface, not in the water, but in the land itself. The seas that once teemed with life began to retreat, but not because the oceans were shrinking, it was because the water was moving upward, locked away in silent sheets of ice. The ice age that followed the flourishing Ordovician seas wasn't like the ones we picture from storybooks. There were no mammoths or saber-toothed cats. This was a much older, quieter freeze, a deep planetary exhale that took the world by surprise. Near the southern pole of the Earth, the ancient continent of Gondwana had drifted across cooler latitudes, and slowly a vast and growing cap of ice began to form. The air cooled, snow layered year after year without fully melting, and over time that snow compressed into glaciers, thick slabs of ice, thousands of meters deep, spreading across the land like a cold, creeping tide. As the ice sheets expanded, they trapped immense amounts of water, and with that frozen grip, the sea levels across the entire planet began to fall. It's strange to think of an ocean drowning, but in a way, that's what happened. The shallow marine habitats, the warm continental shelves where most Ordovician life had evolved, were gradually exposed to open air. What was once a vibrant reef could become dry land in a matter of centuries. The water didn't vanish, it just moved elsewhere, frozen into place. Entire ecosystems were stranded. Delicate coral colonies, fixed in place, were left behind as the water retreated. Creatures adapted to gentle currents and filtered sunlight now faced exposure, isolation, or deadly changes in temperature and pressure. The biodiversity that had once defined these shallow seas began to collapse, not from violence, but from absence. But the cold wasn't only the result of ice, it was being helped along by something even more surprising. High above the seas, on land that had only recently begun to support life, tiny plants were starting to spread. These were not towering trees or lush ferns, not yet, but early mosses and liverworts had found their way into damp soil, and over time they did something remarkable. They began to pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Through photosynthesis, these early plants absorbed sunlight and CO2, releasing oxygen in return, and while they were tiny, they were persistent. Over millions of years, this quiet removal of carbon from the air reduced the greenhouse effect, the warming blanket that had kept Earth temperate. With less carbon to trap the sun's heat, the planet cooled even more. A feedback loop began. The colder it got, the more glaciers formed, and the more carbon was pulled down by plant life and buried in sediments. The cycle fed itself until the cold was no longer a phase, it became a state. In this icy world, only the most adaptable marine species managed to endure. Some migrated to deeper or warmer waters. Others evolved physiological changes to survive in cooler, darker environments. but many simply could not adjust in time. The ocean currents shifted, the chemistry of the water changed, oxygen levels dropped in some regions and surged in others. Species that had thrived for millions of years found themselves suddenly without the environmental anchors they needed to survive. Brachiopods and bryozoans, once dominant filter feeders, saw entire branches of their family tree vanish. Trilobites, once the hard shelled icons of the Ordovician seas, began to disappear in great numbers. Still, in the shadow of the glaciers, small life forms endured. Algae, plankton, and soft bodied invertebrates found refuge in cold currents or beneath the ice. Their resilience, quiet and unnoticed at first, would become the foundation for future oceans once the freeze began to lift. As the world stayed locked in ice, the stage was being set for something else, a slow, uncertain return to warmth. But first, there would be consequences, because whenever life is pushed to its edge, what comes next is never quite the same. Even as glaciers tightened their grip and the shallow seas vanished, not all of life was lost. While the surface world changed dramatically, deeper down in the cold, dark spaces where sunlight never reached, some life managed to endure. These deep sea zones weren't as rich or crowded as the warm, sunlit reefs that once wrapped the continents, but they offered something far more important during a crisis: stability. Temperatures changed more slowly, currents continued to flow, and pressures, though immense, remained steady. Here, in the dim quiet beneath the ice touched waters, certain life forms found refuge. Not because they were strong in the usual sense, but because they were out of reach of the worst disturbances. This idea that some species survive by hiding in overlooked corners is key to understanding how life endures on a changing planet. These hidden places are called refugia, little safe zones in the midst of global collapse. They're not always dramatic. Sometimes they're a trench at the bottom of the sea. Sometimes they're a deeper layer of water where oxygen still lingers. But for the creatures lucky enough to live there, these spaces mean everything. Soft bodied worms, early mollusks, and tiny filter feeders continued their quiet routines as the world above them froze. Their world didn't need coral cities or sunny coastlines. They clung to rocks, sifted nutrients from the water, and reproduced in darkness generation after generation, slow and steady. This persistence may seem simple, even unremarkable, but in reality, it's what allowed the story of marine life to continue. Survival, though, came at a cost. With so much biodiversity lost in the shallows, the genetic pool that remained was limited. This is known as a genetic bottleneck, when a large, varied population is reduced to a small group of survivors. That group carries only a narrow slice of the genetic diversity that once existed. It's like losing an entire library and being left with just a few pages. Enough to rebuild, yes, but never quite the same. For the ocean, this meant that many ancient species never returned. The survivors slowly gave rise to new forms, but the world that followed the Ordovician extinction had a very different biological script. And from an evolutionary perspective, these bottlenecks can be both blessing and burden. On one hand, they limit flexibility. With fewer genes to draw from, adapting to future changes becomes harder. But on the other hand, they can accelerate change, forcing evolution to act quickly, to experiment with new shapes, behaviors, and systems. It's in these moments of recovery that life often reinvents itself. What survives is tested. What adapts gets to shape the next era. Many of the lineages that emerged after the Ordovician were shaped by this narrow filter. They were descendants of deep sea dwellers, cold tolerant species, and generalists that could thrive on less. And even though the richness of life had been dimmed, what returned was more resilient than what came before. That resilience wasn't just about individuals, it lived in the structure of ecosystems, the relationships between predator and prey, between organisms and their environment. Ecosystems are often compared to webs, but after a mass extinction, they look more like loose threads. And yet, even with fewer connections, even with vast gaps in the food chain, life found a way to weave something new. The seafloor, once nearly emptied, began to stir again. Simple mats of bacteria and algae re-established the base of the food web. Tiny scavengers returned to sift through sediment. Slowly, over millions of years, balance started to emerge. This phase wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it mattered because everything that came next, from armored fish to sharks to whales and coral reefs and kelp forests, grew out of these quiet beginnings. And even today, deep beneath modern oceans, there are organisms whose lineages stretch back to those ancient refuges. Species that withstood the cold, the silence, and the loss, and carried Earth's biological memory forward. In the stillness of those early oceans, evolution waited. Not idly, but patiently, building the scaffolding for the world to come. And while the deep sea quietly mended its broken rhythms, the planet itself was preparing for another kind of change, one that would arrive slowly at first, and then all at once. By the time the oceans began to recover from their first great collapse, life had started experimenting with bold, unfamiliar paths. The shallow seas were once again alive with motion, not as rich as before, but filled with strange armored fish, expanding reef systems, and the early stirrings of something new along the water's edge. This was the Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes. It began with promise, and coral reefs stretched across warm coastlines, vast and complex. Jawed fish evolved in shapes the ocean had never seen. Some were sleek and fast, others were plated in bone like underwater tanks. It was a time of evolutionary creativity, of bold new blueprints taking shape beneath the waves. But something was brewing in the background, for not a single catastrophic blow like the kind that would one day strike the dinosaurs, but something slower, quieter, a decline that came in waves, not all at once, but in pulses over tens of millions of years. The Devonian extinction, which began around 375 million years ago, wasn't just one event. It was a drawn out unraveling. At first, it might not have seemed unusual. A few species disappeared here and there. But over time, the losses began to add up. The reefs, once so dominant, began to collapse. Fish species, some of the largest and most specialized, vanished without replacements. And the deeper scientists look into the rocks of this era, the more they find these drop offs, dips in biodiversity that signal yet another blow to an already weakened ecosystem. Many of these losses were felt most deeply in the oceans. Reef building organisms declined sharply, especially the ancient corals and sponges that had long shaped marine habitats. Trilobites, which had barely survived the Ordovician crisis, began to fade again. Jawless fish, once common, nearly disappeared. Even the armored placoderms, the giants of their day, began to vanish. What caused such a prolonged and uneven extinction? The answer, as with much of Earth's history, isn't simple. There wasn't one trigger, but several, each one pushing the planet a little further out of balance. And one of the leading suspects is ocean anoxia, a dangerous condition where vast parts of the sea lose their oxygen. In anoxic waters, life suffocates. Fish can't breathe, reefs can't grow, and microbes take over, releasing toxins that make things worse. Evidence from black shale deposits, rich in organic matter and poor in oxygen, shows that these dead zones were expanding across the ocean floor. Another piece of the puzzle lies in the sky. Impact craters dated to this period suggest that Earth may have been struck by asteroids, though smaller than the one that would later wipe out the dinosaurs. Still, even a modest impact can darken skies, trigger acid rain, and shift the climate, especially when ecosystems are already fragile. But perhaps the most subtle and surprising cause came not from space or sea, but from land. By the mid Devonian, plants had begun spreading in earnest. What had once been low mats of moss had evolved into towering forests, with roots that burrowed deep into the soil and stems that stretched toward the sun. These early trees changed everything. As their roots spread, they broke down rocks and released nutrients into nearby streams. Those nutrients washed into rivers, then into seas. And just like modern fertilizer runoff, they triggered algae blooms, vast green clouds that thrived briefly before collapsing, sinking, and decomposing. The result? More oxygen loss in the oceans. And the trees didn't stop there. They also captured carbon dioxide, pulling it from the air and helping cool the planet. At first, this may have seemed like a good thing, but as carbon dropped, global temperatures began to fall, and ecosystems built for warmth started to suffer. It's a reminder that even life can be an agent of extinction, especially when the world is still finding its balance. While the ocean struggled, something remarkable was beginning to happen just above the shore. Some fish, equipped with lungs and sturdy fins, began to spend short periods in shallow pools and muddy flats. Insects were appearing on land, along with the first primitive amphibians. It was a slow but steady transition from water to land, a shift that would one day lead to reptiles, birds, mammals, and eventually us. But for now, the Devonian was still unraveling. Reefs vanished, fish diversity collapsed, the sea grew quiet in places it had once thrived, and even as forests grew taller, their roots deepened the ecological wounds they helped create. Yet, in these silent moments between extinction pulses, evolution never truly stopped. It only slowed and waited, because something else, something stranger and far more devastating, was still to come. While the oceans swirled with instability and life below the surface struggled to hold on, something entirely new was taking root just above the tide. The land, once barren and quiet, was beginning to stir. It started slowly, with small, moss like plants clinging to wet rock and soil near the water's edge. These early pioneers were simple, low to the ground, and easily overlooked. But over time, they changed everything. As the Devonian period moved forward, plants evolved in both height and complexity. What began as soft mats soon became small stems, then leaves, then roots, and eventually forests. These new root systems were more than just anchors. They were Earth's first real attempt at sculpting the land from within. Roots dug deep into rock, splitting it apart over time. They released acids and minerals, breaking down stone into soil, softening the surface, one layer at a time. But as the roots worked downward, the effects of their presence reached far beyond the forest floor. Rainwater filtered through this newly formed soil, picking up nutrients released by decaying leaves, and weathered rock. That runoff made its way into rivers, and from there, it flowed into the sea. At first, it may have seemed harmless, just fresh water joining the ocean. But hidden in that water were phosphorus, nitrogen, and other minerals that plants had unlocked. And when those nutrients reached the coastlines, they triggered something dangerous. Massive blooms of algae erupted in the shallow seas, a sudden explosion of life that seemed promising, but burned out quickly. As the algae died, they sank to the bottom and began to rot. That decay consumed oxygen from the water, leaving behind dead zones, wide areas where marine animals could no longer breathe. This chain of events, from plant roots breaking rock to nutrient rich runoff to oxygen depleted oceans, created feedback loops that worsened the fragile conditions already troubling marine ecosystems. And that wasn't all the plants were doing. Um, Through photosynthesis, these early forests were pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. As they spread across the continents, the balance of gases in the air began to shift. Carbon levels dropped, and with them, global temperatures followed. In a world still reeling from previous climatic shocks, this added a new layer of cooling, a quiet force slowly tipping the planet toward colder conditions. So while the ocean suffered from suffocation and cooling waters, the land was becoming greener, more textured, and more alive. For the first time in Earth's history, towering stalks cast shadows. Rivers wound their way through wooded valleys. The wind moved through ferns and primitive trees, and in the stillness between the leaves, life found new spaces to explore. Insects began to appear, small and wingless at first, crawling through damp undergrowth. Soon, millipedes, springtails, and early arachnids followed. Their worlds were limited to the forest floor, but they were the first to walk across land as if they belonged there. And just at the edge of the water, fish with fleshy lobe like fins were learning how to push themselves through the mud. Some developed simple lungs, others learned to lift their heads above the surface. Over generations, these early experiments would become the first amphibians, creatures that no longer belonged solely to the sea. Life was not just surviving, it was branching out. It was branching out, Dell with the bathroom soul baiting toast. And where if you'd in the bit stabbed, and where if you rumor you were my. But with every new branch came new risks. The Earth was growing more complex, layering ecosystems across land and sea, above and below, hot and cold, rooted and drifting. And with complexity came instability. Each new form of life brought new chemical exchanges, new atmospheric reactions, new pressures on every other part of the planet. The carbon cycle, once balanced mainly between the ocean and the air, now had a third player, the forest. Weather patterns changed to accommodate the cooling land. Rainfall became more seasonal. Storms became more forceful in areas where trees had softened the ground. And underground, roots continued to stir the earth, digging, breaking, releasing. This wasn't just evolution of species. It was the evolution of Earth's entire system. The atmosphere, the oceans, the land, all linked, all changing, all responding to the life they hosted. And while this new balance allowed for extraordinary expansion, it also carried with it the seeds of collapse. Because as the land began to bloom with potential, the oceans were not yet finished unraveling. As forests quietly deepened their roots into the land, and new life began to scatter across damp soil and leaf littered ground, the oceans were becoming a very different story. They weren't calm, they weren't safe, and they weren't silent. Beneath the surface, something invisible was building, not a creature or a storm, but a chemical shift, a slow, creeping danger that didn't roar or shake the earth. It simply stole the breath from the water. This was the rise of anoxia, a condition where oxygen disappears from the ocean. And for marine life, oxygen is everything. In a healthy sea, oxygen enters from the surface, stirred in by waves and wind, and is circulated downward by ocean currents. Marine animals, from the smallest plankton to the largest fish, rely on this flow to survive. But as global temperatures cooled and nutrient runoff from land increased, those ocean currents began to weaken. Warmer layers of water started to form near the surface, floating above cooler, denser layers below, like oil resting on top of water. This created a kind of lid, preventing the oxygen rich surface from mixing with the depths. Over time, the lower layers of the sea grew stagnant, still, starved of oxygen. These became what we now call dead zones, wide stretches of ocean floor where fish could no longer swim, where coral couldn't grow, and where most forms of animal life simply stopped existing. But the story didn't end there. When oxygen vanishes from the water, it creates room for something else to take over, something ancient, small, and very efficient at surviving in hostile places. Microbes, specifically sulfate reducing bacteria, began to thrive in these anoxic layers. They didn't need oxygen. Instead, they fed on decaying matter and released a byproduct that would turn the seas into something far more dangerous: hydrogen sulfide. Colorless, deadly, and often carried as a gas in the deep water, hydrogen sulfide is toxic to almost all complex life. It can poison the gills of fish, break down tissues, and even seep into the atmosphere if the concentration grows too high. There's some evidence that during parts of the Devonian extinction, these toxic water layers may have reached the surface in certain regions, turning once livable shallows into lethal traps. And the danger didn't stop at death. Here, these same bacteria also contributed to shifts in the planet's delicate chemical balance. As they consumed organic matter and released hydrogen sulfide, they may have altered cloud formation, ozone levels, and even triggered feedback loops that further cooled the planet or warmed it, depending on which gases dominated the sky at any given time. It's strange to think that life could trigger such devastation. But this wasn't life in the form we usually admire, not colorful reefs or curious fish, but bacteria multiplying silently in the dark. Above them, bacterial blooms of another kind surged in the surface waters. Fed by the nutrients pouring in from land, photosynthetic microbes bloomed in dense green layers. These blooms, though bright and full of energy, were often short lived. When they died, they sank, and just like the algae before them, they decayed. And as they decayed, they consumed even more oxygen. It became a cycle: more nutrients, more blooms, more decay, more anoxia. And all the while, the seas grew darker and quieter, not from emptiness, but from something harder to see: chemical shifts, invisible poisons, whole food webs collapsing, not with a crash, but with a fading breath. Yet in this eerie silence, some forms of life persisted. Microbes, especially those adapted to low oxygen or toxic conditions, began to shape their own mini ecosystems. They clung to mineral surfaces, clustered in sediments, and exchanged chemicals like tiny alchemists. Some even used hydrogen sulfide itself as an energy source, converting what was poison to others into fuel for their survival. These microbial communities were incredibly resilient. They didn't need sunlight. They didn't need clean water. And sing water, Fengoi cited, and they didn't need oxygen. And they only needed time. And time, of course, is what Earth has in abundance. While most larger marine species dwindled and evolutionary branches withered into stone, these microbial survivors endured. They remained, unchanged in their simplicity, wading through chaos, thriving where others couldn't. And long after the oceans had gone still, long after the reefs had collapsed and the ancient fish had vanished, these microscopic threads of life continued quietly in the depth, keeping the planet's story alive. Because even as the oceans choked, and even as extinction spread like a shadow across the seas, the earth below and above was already beginning to stir with something new, something deep, fiery, and far more catastrophic than anything yet seen. While the oceans darkened and swirled with invisible poisons, the land was becoming a canvas for something remarkable. A quiet revolution had been spreading, not sudden, not loud, but transformative in every way. This was the Devonian greening of Earth. In earlier ages, the land had been little more than bare rock and wind, scattered with patches of mosses and low growing plants clinging to damp edges. But now, something new had taken hold. Willow vascular plants, those with internal plumbing, able to move water and nutrients through roots and stems, had begun to evolve and rise. With stronger stalks and a better grip on the soil, they no longer just crept across the ground. They climbed. As millions of years passed, those simple stalks turned into towering stems, and then trunks. Leaves grew broader, branches reached higher, roots dug deeper. The first forests were born. These weren't quite like the forests we know today. There were no birds in the branches, no flowering plants, no grass beneath, but there were towering tree-like species such as Archaeopteris, with fern-like leaves and woody stems, forming thick canopies over the once barren land. Spore-bearing trees stood in clusters, dense mats of root systems stretched underground, and where once sunlight had touched every inch of stone, now deep shadows pooled between the trees. These forests did far more than decorate the earth. They reshaped it. As their roots spread, they broke down rock faster than any natural process before them. They created soil at a scale never seen. That soil trapped rainwater, softened floodwaters, and began to regulate the flow of rivers. But perhaps their most powerful influence came from the air. Forests breathe. Through photosynthesis, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen in return. And with the sudden spread of green life, oxygen levels soared. Earth's air, once a thin mix of reactive gases, became richer, more breathable. At the same time, carbon dioxide, the gas that traps heat in the atmosphere, began to decline. The effect wasn't instant, but over millions of years, the cumulative breath of forests began to cool the planet. Less carbon meant a thinner greenhouse blanket. Temperatures dipped, glaciers began to expand again, and, and the changing climate added another layer of stress to already fragile marine systems. What the trees had done, unintentionally of course, was shift the thermostat of an entire planet. And that wasn't their only surprise. As plants grew, died, and fell to the ground, their bodies piled up in thick layers of organic matter. In swamps, along riverbanks, and in floodplains, this material was buried under mud and silt, protected from decay. Instead of returning carbon to the air, this organic matter locked it away underground, compressing slowly over eons into coal. This process, the burial of carbon, was one of the most significant steps in Earth's climate evolution. It meant that plants weren't just pulling carbon from the air, they were removing it from the cycle altogether. The forests were becoming both carbon sinks and climate regulators. But like many powerful forces, they came with a double edge. The same trees that cooled the air and shaped the soil also destabilized the systems they fed. As roots deepened and soils thickened, they unleashed massive amounts of nutrients into rivers. That nutrient rich water flowed to the oceans, feeding algae blooms, worsening the oxygen starved dead zones we explored earlier. The forests hadn't caused the collapse of marine ecosystems alone, but they had added pressure to an already strained system. And the forests themselves weren't immune to risk. For when carbon dioxide levels dropped too low, plants struggled to grow. Their own success created the conditions for droughts, soil degradation, and even more cooling. The balance they built was delicate, easily tipped toward extremes. They were creators of life, expanding the possibilities for land dwelling organisms. But they were also, in their own way, agents of disruption. And yet, without these forests, the world would never have become what it is now. They laid the groundwork for ecosystems that would one day buzz with insects, echo with bird song, and shimmer with the movement of mammals beneath canopies. But for now, in the stillness of this early green age, the earth was holding its breath. Because even as life on land took its first deep root, the planet itself was preparing to open a wound so deep it would nearly erase everything once more. The forests had risen, the oceans had changed. Life, despite every obstacle, had spread across land, sea, and sky. By around 252 million years ago, Earth was teeming with diversity. The continents had drawn close together, forming a vast supercontinent known as Pangaea. It stretched nearly from pole to pole, a single connected landmass wrapped in ancient seas. Across it, the land pulsed with life. On the coasts and plains, dense forests hummed with activity. Early reptiles crawled through ferns, amphibians basked along riverbanks, giant insects buzzed in the heavy air, and plants reached high into a sky rich with oxygen. In the oceans, coral-like creatures formed reefs, armored fish, squid-like nautiloids, and slow-moving trilobites shared the water with strange shelled swimmers and early marine reptiles. It was, in many ways, a world finding its rhythm again, a planet that had learned how to flourish after every collapse. And then it ended. Not slowly, not in pulses like the Devonian unraveling. This was something else. A single event, or perhaps a cascade of tightly linked disasters, triggered the most catastrophic extinction Earth has ever known. It's called the Great Dying. Well, in the fossil record, it appears like a sudden cliff. Nearly 96% of marine species vanished. Creatures that had thrived in every corner of the ocean simply disappeared. On land, around 70% of all vertebrate species were lost. Entire ecosystems, entire food chains, erased. The forests withered. Insects, which had survived every extinction so far, faced a massive collapse. For a time, it seems the land was nearly silent. So what happened? Well, that question still haunts paleontologists and geologists today. Because while we know the outcome, the exact cause remains a mystery. But the clues are there, deep in the rock, locked inside minerals, written in carbon and sulfur. One major suspect is volcanism, Not just ordinary eruptions, but a planetary scale firestorm. In what is now Siberia, an enormous region called the Siberian Traps erupted. These weren't single explosions, they, they were massive lava flows that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, spewing out enough molten rock to blanket millions of square kilometers. With the lava came vast clouds of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide gases that filled the sky, poisoned the rain, and suffocated the oceans. The carbon drove a massive spike in global temperatures, one of the sharpest ever recorded. Oceans warmed, ice melted, and oxygen, already fragile in deep waters, vanished completely in many places. Anoxia returned, with hydrogen sulfide not far behind. The sulfur dioxide brought acid rain, which leached into soils, damaging forests and killing delicate plants. The air became harder to breathe, the water harder to drink. Earth had become, quite literally, a hostile world. This extinction was different, not just in size, but in depth. It didn't only strike the surface of life, it dug down into the very framework of ecosystems. Even microbial mats and plankton, which usually recover quickly, were devastated. For millions of years afterward, the planet seemed broken. Fossil layers show a long stretch of time where life clung on, but barely. Few species, few ecosystems, a period of biological silence. Scientists describe it as an evolutionary bottleneck where most lineages were cut off, and the future of life had to pass through a tiny, narrow doorway. The creatures that did survive were often small, hardy, and incredibly adaptable. Burrowers, scavengers, generalists, those that could endure wide swings in temperature, diet, and environment. And when life finally began to recover, millions of years later, it looked completely different. The Great Dying wasn't just a reset. Mufamatang, it was a rewrite. The Permian-Triassic extinction shattered the biological order that had existed for hundreds of millions of years. It paved the way for new groups to rise, including the ancestors of dinosaurs, mammals, and eventually humans. But in its aftermath, Earth carried scars, not just in stone, but in the structure of life itself. And as we follow the thread of survival forward, we find that extinction is never truly the end. Because even in the deepest dark, something always stirs. The great dying had left the earth wounded, but it didn't begin in silence. Its opening act was fire. To understand how life unraveled so quickly and completely during the Permian-Triassic extinction, we have to travel to what is now Siberia. But 252 million years ago, this place was no frozen wilderness. It was the beating heart of one of the most violent and prolonged geological events in Earth's history. This was the rise of the Siberian Traps, an immense region of volcanic flood basalts where lava didn't just erupt from a single peak, but poured out through deep cracks in the crust like a slow, unstoppable tide. And it didn't last for days or weeks. It went on for hundreds of thousands of years. Eruption after eruption blanketed the landscape in thick layers of molten rock, building up one of the largest volcanic provinces the planet has ever seen. The total area covered by these flows may have been as large as the continental United States. But it wasn't the lava itself that caused the crisis. It was what came with it, gases ejected in unimaginable quantities. Every volcanic outburst released carbon dioxide CO2 into the atmosphere billions of tons at a time, and with each passing year, the CO2 built up. It trapped heat like a blanket around the planet, triggering a runaway greenhouse effect. temperatures soared, and some estimates suggest the oceans warmed by more than 10 degrees Celsius in certain regions, a massive destabilizing change. And it wasn't just carbon. Volcanoes also released methane, a far more potent greenhouse gas. This methane didn't only come from the eruptions themselves, but may have been released from the seafloor, where it had been locked away for ages as methane hydrates, frozen in icy crystals beneath the ocean sediment. As the ocean warmed, these hydrates melted, suddenly releasing vast amounts of methane into the water and air. This added fuel to the already burning atmosphere, intensifying the heat and tipping the climate further off balance. Rain, once a gentle part of the Earth's cycle, turned corrosive. The volcanic emissions included sulfur dioxide, SO2, which mixed with water vapor in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid. And when it fell, it didn't nourish, it burned. Acid rain poured onto forests, stripping leaves, damaging soils, and killing delicate freshwater species. Even ecosystems far from the volcanoes suffered under skies that rained poison. Meanwhile, the oceans were changing too. As atmospheric CO2 increased, more of it dissolved into seawater, triggering ocean acidification. This shifted the chemistry of the water, making it harder for marine organisms to build shells or skeletons. Corals, plankton, shellfish, the base of the marine food chain, struggled to survive. Whole communities that depended on these tiny builders collapsed in their absence. But perhaps the most invisible danger came from above. Some scientists believe that the Siberian eruptions damaged the planet's ozone layer, the thin shield that protects life from harmful ultraviolet radiation. This may have happened through the release of halogen gases or through indirect chemical interactions triggered by the massive injection of pollutants into the atmosphere. Without this protective layer, more UV radiation would have reached the surface. Plants, already suffering from acid rain and temperature stress, became vulnerable to sunlight itself. Spores and seeds may have failed to germinate, and marine plankton near the surface, sensitive to light, may have been scorched beyond recovery. All these forces, greenhouse gases, acid rain, toxic oceans, and radiation, work together in a kind of ecological feedback loop. Each one amplified the others. The heat weakened the forests, and when rain stripped away their defenses, the dying forests released more carbon. The seas turned hostile, and where your hove bedå the gates of bor, and where your hove the ferius fractvers to plov, and where die fortvers fav to moibol, recover spolt, and life cornered from every direction began to fall, but not all at once. There's evidence that the worst effects of the Siberian traps played out over thousands of years. A slow suffocation. Ibanjo, a drawn-out firestorm, the kind of change that life couldn't adapt to fast enough. And when the skies finally cleared, when the lava cooled and the gases thinned, the world that remained was barely recognizable. Landscapes once green were now barren. Oceans once rich were still and quiet. The earth had not simply lost species, it had lost structures. The connections between things, the balance between systems, and in that deep, disturbed silence, life had no choice but to begin again. But even as the earth struggled to heal, the story of evolution pressed forward, because something new was waiting in the shadows. And soon, that new life would rise into the light. After the lava stopped flowing and the poisoned skies began to clear, the earth was no longer the world it had once been, not just in color or temperature or atmosphere, but in life itself. Because what followed the Permian-Triassic extinction wasn't just a thinning of the web of life, it was a collapse, a near total erasure of what the planet had spent hundreds of millions of years building. Roughly 96% of all marine species were gone. 70% of terrestrial vertebrates vanished. Entire ecosystems, not just the organisms within them, but the very relationships that had held them together, disappeared. It's difficult, even with numbers, to grasp the scale of such a loss. And imagine walking through a reef that once hummed with life, now silent, every surface bare. Imagine forests reduced to skeletal remains, roots decaying beneath ash-heavy soil. Imagine skies without birds, rivers without frogs, seas without fish. You, the fossil record captures this silence in stone. Below the extinction layer, in rocks just older than the event, you find abundance. Fossils of coral-like organisms building delicate reef structures, trilobites, still clinging to survival after millions of years, crawling across the sea floor. Shelled creatures like ammonoids and brachiopods, curled in spirals or stacked in colonies. Even in the murky shallows, crinoids and sponges filter fed in rhythmic stillness. Then, suddenly, the layer shifts, and above it, almost nothing. This sharp break in fossil abundance is how paleontologists first recognized the magnitude of the event. A thriving ocean full of form, texture, and movement replaced by empty stone. In some regions, the seafloor went from rich limestone to barren shale. No trace of reefs, no scattered shells, just dark, featureless mud. On land, the story was just as stark. Before the extinction, amphibians roamed the swamps and river edges. Broad-headed temnospondyls, sleek eel-like swimmers, and early proto-reptiles lived among lush ferns and tall trees. But in the aftermath, their fossils almost vanish. Entire groups were lost forever. Lineages that had existed for tens of millions of years simply stopped leaving a record. And even insects, which are typically among the most resilient and widespread organisms, suffered massive reductions in diversity. The few species that did survive often became dominant by default. They weren't necessarily better suited to the new world. They were simply still here, occupying space once filled by dozens of others. And yet, perhaps what's most haunting isn't just the loss itself, it's what it says about how fragile life can be, even on a planet that seems eternal. We often think of extinction as something slow and distant, a natural part of the background. But here was a moment when almost everything ended, quickly, globally, and with no warning that could have been understood by the creatures living through it. There's something chilling about that. It asks quiet questions. How much pressure can Earth take before it resets itself? How interconnected is everything? Forests, oceans, microbes, air. And how fast can it all unravel if just the right combination of things goes wrong? The Permian-Triassic extinction didn't just reveal what was lost, and it revealed the limits of life's complexity. Before the collapse, ecosystems had become rich, layered, and interdependent. Each organism played a role, from the smallest decomposer to the largest predator. But complexity comes with vulnerability. When one piece fails, oxygen in the water, for example, the collapse can echo upward, taking everything else with it. Earth had pushed itself into a corner, and the great dying was its way of starting over. But even amid this near total loss, a few threads still held. Tiny burrowing animals survived in pockets of livable soil. Microbes endured in the shadows of the sea. And as millions of years passed, these quiet survivors began weaving together new ecosystems. Still, for a long stretch of time afterward, the world felt emptied. Fossil layers from the early Triassic show a bleak record: low diversity, simple food chains, and a biological landscape trying to find its footing again. It would take more than recovery, it would take reinvention. And as the Earth began to rewrite the rules of life, a new group was preparing to rise from the ashes of extinction, a group that would one day dominate both land and sky. When the world had burned and choked and fallen silent, when oceans turned to graveyards and forests to dust, not everything was gone. Not quite. A handful of life forms, small, quiet, almost invisible, had found ways to endure. They didn't conquer the devastation, they simply survived it. And in doing so, they became the unexpected architects of Earth's next chapter. Among the most crucial were creatures that dug into the earth itself, begun burrowers, and not powerful, not fast, not fierce, but hidden. By retreating into the soil, these animals escaped the worst of the poisoned air and searing heat. Their homes beneath the surface became shelters from extinction. Here, oxygen levels were slightly more stable, temperatures didn't swing so wildly, and most importantly, danger often passed them by. Some of these survivors were early therapsids, distant relatives of mammals, small bodied, low energy creatures with simple diets. They didn't need much to survive, and they weren't picky about what they ate. This generalist strategy proved to be a lifesaver. In a world where specialized food chains had collapsed, being flexible was a superpower. The ones that made it through were often small in size, needing less food and space. They didn't tower over the landscape, they tucked themselves into it. They didn't hunt in packs, they scurried, scavenged, and adapted. Even more resilient were the microbial life forms, tiny, ancient, and astonishingly hardy. While complex organisms vanished in droves, bacteria and archaea kept going, especially the ones that thrived in extreme conditions. Hot springs, deep sea vents, toxic brines, these were not hostile environments to them, but home. Microbes could survive temperatures that would cook most life. They could process chemicals like sulfur and methane for energy. And in the eerie silence of the post extinction Earth, they were among the first to start rebuilding the invisible scaffolding of life, restoring the balance of gases, breaking down waste, and laying the microbial foundation for ecosystems yet to come. This period created what scientists call an evolutionary bottleneck, a moment when life's diversity shrinks to a narrow funnel. Many lineages were gone forever, but the ones that remained, the lucky few, became the ancestors of everything that followed. Through this narrow gate, evolution passed new instructions. From this crucible emerged the first hints of what would one day become mammals. And from the scattered remains of early reptiles, a new dynasty would begin its rise, the Archosaurs, the group that would eventually include dinosaurs, crocodiles, and birds. It's strange to think that the great thunder lizards of the Jurassic were descendants of small, scaly survivors who once crawled through ash and waited for the sky to clear. But that's what extinction does. It doesn't just end things, it reshapes what's possible. Life didn't return to how it had been before the Great Dying. It couldn't. Too much had been lost. Instead, it moved in new directions, taking strange turns, forming new alliances, inventing new forms. The age of amphibian dominance had ended. The sprawling coal forests were gone. The trilobites, once rulers of the ocean floor, were extinct. In their absence, niches opened up, and evolution, ever restless, began to fill them again. From charred ground and acidified seas, from low oxygen pockets and broken food chains, life began to stitch itself back together. Slowly, unevenly, miraculously. This is one of the quiet truths of mass extinctions. They're not just about loss, they're about opportunity. Not hopeful ones, necessarily, but raw, brutal, natural ones. When ecosystems fall apart, space is made for new ones to form. And the survivors, no matter how small or fragile, carry the seeds of everything to come. The Permian-Triassic extinction had pushed Earth to the brink, but from that edge, life didn't let go. It held on, with claws, with spores, with root tips and scavenging teeth. It found cracks to grow in, shadows to hide in, and chances to begin again. And what rose next would shape the most iconic era of prehistoric Earth. Because the stage was finally set for a new reign, one ruled not by shadows or survivors, but by giants. Just as life had begun to breathe again, it happened. Another blow, another erasure. And once more, the world was forced to start over. Roughly 200 million years ago, the Earth was still in recovery. It had taken millions of years for nature to rebuild after the Great Dying. But slowly, stubbornly, it had. The oceans shimmered with new swimmers. The land held ferns, forests, insects, and early reptiles. Strange looking creatures with names long lost to time wandered across the broken landscape. Even tiny proto-mammals had carved out homes in the underbrush and crevices. It wasn't paradise, but it was life. Life in a new form, fragile, creative, still adapting. And then the ground began to shake again, not just in one place, but across a vast stretch of the Earth's crust. And this time the trigger came from deep below the surface, from a geological force building for eons beneath the supercontinent, Pangaea. Massive rifts opened up as the land slowly began to tear itself apart. The beginnings of what would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. But this tearing wasn't quiet. It came with fire. Volcanoes on a scale hard to even imagine erupted across what we now call the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, an area stretching from modern-day North America to parts of Europe, South America, and Africa. The eruptions didn't just last for days or years, they went on for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe more. With each explosion, billions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane were released into the sky. Greenhouse gases wrapped the planet in a thickening blanket. Temperatures soared. Oceans warmed rapidly. Rain became acidic. Tonight's Lake, Bert Verbackpool Poi Orkest, Bert some lay down ver high vry. Oxygen levels in the seas dropped again, stifling marine life. And the sky may have turned hazy and dim with soot and ash. The result? Another mass extinction. This one may not have been as total as the Permian disaster before it, but it was still devastating. And this time, it came just as ecosystems were beginning to stabilize again. Species that had barely survived the last extinction now vanished completely. Countless marine reptiles disappeared from the seas. Many of the amphibians, which had once been dominant on land, were hit hard, their soft skin and delicate eggs ill suited for the newly chaotic world. Even the small early mammals, Those clever little creatures that had once crawled through the ashes and burrows of catastrophe took a hit. Many of their lineages were wiped out in this fiery purge. But just as before, not everything vanished. There were others, those who would not just survive, but thrive. As Among the creatures that endured the worst of the volcanic winter were a particular group of reptiles. They weren't the biggest or strongest at first, but they had something special: versatility. These were the early dinosaurs, fast, upright, and efficient. Some walked on two legs, some on four, and some were meat eaters, others plant grazers. And when the dust from the eruptions began to settle, for when the skies cleared enough for the sun to peek through again, when the ecosystems once again stood empty and open, it was the dinosaurs who stepped forward. They didn't rush in all at once. They evolved slowly, cautiously, across millions of years. But what matters is that they found room, and room to grow, for room to rule. In the great theater of evolution, the Triassic extinction had pulled the curtain down on one cast and handed the stage over to another. Without that moment of devastation, without that collapse of rivals and reordering of nature, dinosaurs might never have risen to dominance. They may have remained just one group among many, odd reptiles in the background of a different age. But the extinction gave them their opportunity. And what followed would become one of the most iconic eras in Earth's deep story, not because of how it began, but because of who seized the moment. The world was now ready for giants, for scales and teeth and thunderous footsteps. The age of dinosaurs had begun. The earth does not forget. It remembers in pressure and stone, in shifting plates and buried fire. And sometimes those memories rise to the surface with heat, as if the planet needs to remind itself that everything can change in a blink. As the Triassic period neared its end, the great supercontinent Pangaea was beginning to crack. This colossal landmass, once a single, unified sweep of continents stitched together, was now under tension. Beneath the surface, the Earth's mantle bubbled and stretched. Deep inside, molten rock pushed upward, straining the crust until it split. And when it split, it burned. This rifting wasn't a single line down the map. It was a network of wounds, a tearing of the world across what is now the Central Atlantic region, from the Eastern Americas to Western Africa and Europe. As the land separated, it created new ocean basins. The Atlantic Ocean, so calm today, was born from this ancient violence. But birth, in the story of Earth, often comes at a cost. As the plates pulled apart, they unleashed volcanism on a scale difficult to grasp. Lava spilled, not just from mountain peaks, but from vast cracks, fissures that oozed molten rock for hundreds of thousands of years. These eruptions weren't quick, they were relentless, and there was the region known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province became a fiery wound in the planet's skin. And with each eruption, more gases were thrown into the air: carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane billowing into the sky, thickening the atmosphere and darkening the sun. The planet's climate tipped once more into chaos. The oceans, which had only recently begun recovering, started warming again. The upper layers became hotter, more acidic, less able to hold oxygen. Delicate ecosystems, already teetering from the last extinction, faced sudden temperature jumps and chemical stress. Acid rain fell from skies soaked in sulfur, and it scoured the land, leached nutrients from the soil, and poisoned freshwater habitats. On land, plants struggled, and in water, plankton, the very foundation of marine food webs, began to collapse. Each disruption fed into the next. Warm oceans released even more methane from seafloor clathrates. Methane, far more potent than carbon dioxide, created a feedback loop: more heat, more release, more warming. The climate didn't just shift, it spun out of control. Species began disappearing again, not all at once, but in bursts. What was thriving one millennium could vanish in the next. Entire ecosystems flipped like a switch had been thrown. Predators lost their prey. Forests changed their composition. Food chains collapsed and reassembled into stranger, thinner forms. And once more, the Earth showed its tendency to lock itself into loops. Because the systems of our planet, climate, ocean, atmosphere, life, are all connected. When one thread frays, others unravel. And when a force like volcanism jolts the balance, the web doesn't break immediately, but it begins to tremble. The ecosystems of this time were fragile in new ways. With each extinction event, nature became more specialized. Creatures evolved into narrow niches, finely tuned to specific diets, climates, or habitats. This made them efficient, but also vulnerable. When the environment changed, even slightly, these species had nowhere to go, nothing else to eat, no fallback plan. So when the air turned sour and the oceans swelled with heat and acid, many simply vanished. This wasn't a mass extinction in the same thunderous way as before. Not yet. But it was a series of tipping points, a chain of ecological missteps that left Earth reeling. And at the center of it all was the planet itself: tectonics and temperature, gas and fire, writing another page in the long, quiet book of extinction. But even in all this turmoil, something new was stirring. The survivors, those few creatures who could weather the heat, who found food in chaos and shelter in change, were beginning to rise. And what they would become would change the world. When the dust and gas finally thinned, when the volcanic skies began to clear, when the ash-laced winds softened, and the oceans found their breath again, the world that emerged was emptier, stranger, and waiting. The great undoing of the Triassic extinction hadn't just ended lives, it had created space. A strange truth of evolution is that extinction isn't only an end, it's also an opening. And through that open door, new creatures stepped forward. Among them were the dinosaurs. They didn't arrive with thunder. They weren't the biggest or the fiercest at first. In fact, when they first appeared around 230 million years ago, dinosaurs were small, two-legged animals, nimble, fast, and lightly built. And, but in this shattered world, those very traits became superpowers. Many of their former rivals were gone. Amphibians, early mammal-like reptiles, and other dominant Triassic life forms had been thinned out. And what remained couldn't compete with the design advantages dinosaurs carried quietly in their bones, and their upright posture, standing tall with legs beneath the body instead of sprawling to the side, gave them a distinct edge. It meant they could run more efficiently, support heavier bodies, and conserve energy while moving across vast landscapes. Inside, their respiratory systems were unlike most others. Their lungs functioned with air sacs, an innovation that allowed continuous airflow, more oxygen, and better cooling. In a warming world where heat could kill as surely as hunger, this internal cooling system was a quiet revolution. Their skeletons were lightweight but strong, with hollow bones that made movement easier and faster. Their senses, particularly sight and balance, were sharp, letting them react quickly in uncertain environments. But maybe their greatest advantage was adaptability. For dinosaurs were not one thing. That they came in all sizes and shapes. Some ran on two legs, others on four. Some had armor, others had speed. Some were carnivores, others gentle leaf eaters. They didn't just take over one role in the ecosystem, they filled many. From dense forests to open plains, from coastal wetlands to arid deserts, dinosaurs began to stretch across the planet like a growing shadow. And they did this not because they were inevitable, but because so much else had vanished. This is one of the most haunting patterns in Earth's story. Destruction clears the way. The fall of one kingdom becomes the rise of another. Had the Triassic extinction not occurred, had those earlier reptiles and amphibians survived in large numbers, dinosaurs might have remained minor players. But the world had been reset, and when evolution found an empty stage, it handed the script to them. Still, it wasn't a fast takeover. It took millions of years for dinosaurs to rise to dominance. Their early success wasn't marked by size or terror, but by resilience. They grew into the world's new rules slowly, finding ways to survive where others couldn't. By the late Triassic and early Jurassic, they had become the architects of ecosystems. Large herbivores shaped the plant life. Hunters balanced populations. Their very presence rewrote the rhythms of life. The earth, still healing, now beat to the pace of thunderous footsteps and low echoing calls. But this too, like all eras, was temporary. The story of life is not a ladder with rungs, but a cycle: growth, collapse, rebirth. And though the dinosaurs now ruled the earth, the seeds of their eventual downfall were already being sown in silence. For even in this flourishing age of giants, the planet was still shifting. Continents continued to drift, sea levels rose and fell, temperatures fluctuated, and new pressures, unseen, unspoken, were already beginning to build. By the late Cretaceous, the Earth had become a lush, living mosaic. Forests stretched across continents, rich with color and complexity. Flowering plants had exploded in variety and scent, drawing insects and birds into new patterns of interaction. The skies shimmered with flying reptiles, their wings slicing the wind like ancient gliders. The seas churned with great marine reptiles, some longer than buses, gliding silently above coral plains. And on land, dinosaurs stood tall, dominant and diverse, moving through swampy deltas and forested plateaus like walking myths. Life had recovered and risen high. Creatures like Tyrannosaurus rex, with its massive jaw and crushing bite, prowled as apex predators. Armored ankylosaurs rumbled through the undergrowth, their clubbed tails swaying like wrecking balls. Graceful hadrosaurs lifted their heads to graze from tall trees, and the sky sang with the calls of early birds, distant relatives of both dinosaur and dream. It was a world in full bloom, vibrant, pulsing with biodiversity. Yet, beneath the beauty, time was ticking. Roughly 66 million years ago, a moment came that would carve a deep scar across the planet's story. A rock, perhaps 6 to 9 miles wide, moving faster than anything on Earth, tore through the sky and struck near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. In an instant, everything changed. The force of the impact was beyond comprehension. It released more energy than 1 billion atomic bombs. Shock waves tore through the crust, A crater over 100 miles wide and 12 miles deep opened in the blink of an eye. Molten rock vaporized, the very atmosphere ignited. Debris from the impact shot into the sky, red hot and furious. As it rained back down, the heat ignited global wildfires. Forests burned. Smoke and soot rose into the stratosphere, where they began to spread like a dark veil. And then the light dimmed. For weeks, months, maybe years, the sunlight struggled to reach Earth's surface. Plants wilted in the absence of light. Photosynthesis slowed, then stopped. With the collapse of plant life came the collapse of herbivores, and soon after, the predators that fed on them. The entire food chain began to crumble from the bottom up. The oceans, too, were not spared. Plankton, the tiny photosynthetic organisms that feed marine life, died off in massive numbers. Coral reefs, already delicate, withered. Marine reptiles vanished. Waves carried silence where once life had surged. In the rocks left behind, scientists have found a thin band of iridium rich clay, an element rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids. This layer exists all over the globe, in sediments from that time, acting like a planetary signature of the event. Below that layer, a record of life. Above it, a record of loss. And near the Gulf of Mexico, the Chicxulub crater still yawns beneath the ground, a buried reminder of the impact that turned the Mesozoic page. More than 75% of Earth's species disappeared. Dinosaurs, except for the avian line that would become birds, were among the most famous casualties, but many others followed. Flying reptiles, ammonites, and countless marine and terrestrial species. Even the air changed. The impact likely released huge amounts of sulfur, creating acid rain that burned through leaves, poisoned water, and altered the chemistry of soil and sea. In some places, layers of charcoal suggest wildfires raged uncontrollably, covering continents in smoke and ash. It's hard to imagine the sky going dark, the world falling cold, a silence settling where once there was so much sound. And yet, this is what happened. Still, even in this darkness, some small, unnoticed creatures clung to the edges. Seeds waited patiently underground. Tiny mammals scurried through tunnels. Birds, light enough to survive on meager resources, took to the air and found safety among the trees. Because once again, the end wasn't the end. It began in silence, a silent descent through the blackness of space. The asteroid that would end an age was roughly 6 miles wide, but its speed was what made it devastating. Moving at over 40,000 miles per hour, it struck Earth with a force equivalent to more than 100 million megatons of TNT. For perspective, that's more than 1 billion times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The point of impact was shallow sea near what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula, and when it hit, the sea exploded into the sky. In an instant, rock turned to plasma. Earth's crust buckled, melted, and hurled itself into the atmosphere. A crater formed over 100 miles wide, deep enough to swallow Mount Everest. The shock wave tore through land, water, and air with unstoppable fury. Within seconds, firestorms ignited across continents. Trees burst into flame from the sheer heat of the falling ejecta, the debris thrown into the sky during the impact. It didn't just fall gently like ash, it re entered Earth's atmosphere like a fiery rain, heating the air to oven like temperatures. Anything exposed was scorched. Cities didn't exist yet, but if they had, they would have been flattened by the earthquakes alone. Seismic waves from the impact circled the globe, not once, but several times, shaking the ground, collapsing mountainsides and triggering volcanoes far from the impact site. And then came the tsunamis. These were not ordinary waves. Some were thousands of feet high, racing across oceans at jet like speeds. Coastlines were erased. Shallow seas became deserts. Anything living near the shore, which was most marine life at the time, had no chance. Sediment layers from that day still show marine creatures jumbled together with land debris, tossed violently by waves that defied understanding. But even that destruction wasn't the worst of it. The real damage came not from the impact itself, but from what followed. The explosion sent trillions of tons of dust and sulfur into the sky, ash from wildfires, pulverized rock, vaporized seawater. All of it formed a global shroud that wrapped the earth in darkness. The sunlight dimmed. For weeks, maybe months, daylight was reduced to a dim, reddish haze, or disappeared entirely in some places. Temperatures plummeted. This wasn't a season or even a year of cold. This was a global winter, a sudden, brutal freeze that choked the life out of plants and plankton, the very foundation of the food web. The cold wasn't the only problem. The sky had changed in chemistry too. Sulfur rich gases blasted into the upper atmosphere, combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid droplets, a kind of high altitude fog that reflected sunlight away and further cooled the earth. But when those droplets eventually fell, they returned as acid rain. It burned through plant leaves, poisoned rivers and lakes, and leached nutrients from the soil. Even the oceans weren't safe. Acidification disrupted delicate marine ecosystems, destroying coral reefs and shell forming plankton that had managed to survive the immediate blast. It was a cascade failure. One shock led to another. Food chains buckled, climates flipped, ecosystems collapsed. Herbivores starved when plants vanished. Carnivores starved when the herbivores disappeared. The species that had filled every niche, every branch of the tree of life, fell, one after the other. All of this triggered by one event, a rock, a moment. But the story doesn't pause there. Just as the sky began to clear and warmth crept back to the surface, a few scattered survivors stepped forward, not because they were the strongest, but often because they were the smallest, the most adaptable, or simply the luckiest. In the silence that followed the impact, after the fires dimmed, after the skies darkened, after the oceans churned and calmed again, the world was forever changed. Life, once so loud and diverse, had gone quiet. The most iconic casualties of the catastrophe were the non avian dinosaurs. These were the towering creatures that had ruled the earth for over 160 million years. The tyrannosaurs, the long necked sauropods, the horned and plated giants that once thundered across ancient plains. Their bones now lie buried beneath layers of soot and clay, their final chapters sealed in the rock by a razor thin line of iridium. But they weren't alone in their fall. Marine reptiles, too, were swept away. The plesiosaurs, long necked hunters of the deep seas, and the mosasaurs, massive serpent like predators that ruled warm, shallow oceans, vanished. These creatures had adapted brilliantly to their aquatic environments, but when the oceans turned toxic and the food chains collapsed, their time came to an end. Pterosaurs, the winged reptiles of the skies, also disappeared. Some had wingspans that rivaled small planes, gliding above coastlines and forests, but they were likely dependent on large fish populations or specific nesting environments, both of which were disrupted beyond repair. And so the skies they once dominated grew still. Even the ammonites, distant relatives of today's squid and octopuses, spiraled out of existence. These beautifully coiled creatures had survived multiple previous extinctions, evolving into countless shapes and sizes over millions of years. But this time, the oceans offered no safe harbor. Their extinction marked not just the end of a lineage, but the loss of entire ecosystems built around them. And yet, not everything died. Birds, descendants of certain small feathered dinosaurs, somehow made it through. It's still not entirely clear why. Perhaps their ability to fly helped them escape danger, or maybe their diverse diets, seeds, insects, carrion, gave them more options when food was scarce. Some likely lived near fresh water or forests, where the impact was less severe. They were small, fast, and flexible, traits that would become incredibly valuable in a world reshaped by fire and frost. Mammals, too, held on. At the time, they weren't the dominant creatures we know today. They were mostly small, nocturnal insect eaters, shrew like animals that darted through underbrush or tunneled into soil. But their modest size, burrowing behavior, and non picky diets gave them an edge. They could hide from the elements, they could eat what others couldn't. And unlike the towering reptiles that needed vast amounts of food to survive, mammals could scrape by on little. Crocodilians also endured. These ancient reptiles had already proven themselves masters of survival, outlasting other groups through adaptability. They could live in both freshwater and marine environments. They were ambush predators, conserving energy for long stretches, and crucially, they could go months without food. When the skies darkened and prey became scarce, that trait became a quiet superpower. Survival wasn't about strength, it wasn't about intelligence or speed, it was about timing, placement, and flexibility. Some lived simply because they were in the right place at the right time, a population of birds that happened to nest in forested valleys instead of open plains, a group of mammals whose underground dens shielded them from the searing heat and acid rain, a clutch of crocodilian eggs that avoided the freeze, and others died not from the immediate blast, but from the slow unraveling that came after. Species that depended on a very specific food source. Animals that lived too large, too exposed, too dependent on climate patterns that no longer existed. What's most haunting is how thin the line was, how small the difference between life and extinction turned out to be. Some creatures survived simply because they could eat anything. Others perished because they could eat only one thing. Some lasted because they could burrow. Others fell because they stood tall. Some flew away. Others couldn't. And in the ashes of this lost world, the survivors, battered, hidden, overlooked, began to move again, to creep, to dig, to sing, and slowly they would begin to fill the emptiness. From this fragile thread of survival, the next age would emerge, not just shaped by chance, but by a legacy of endurance. And as the world warmed, and plants returned, and skies cleared, a new story began, not of giants, but of mammals, not of what was lost, but of what would now be possible. In the lingering shadow of the impact, the earth trembled under a sky choked with dust. What had once been a vibrant, sprawling web of ecosystems had unraveled into silence. But in that silence, life, small, quiet, and almost invisible, persisted. It was here, in the cracks of devastation, that mammals found a way not just to survive, but to endure. Unlike the massive reptiles that had once ruled the land, mammals didn't need sunlight to flourish. Their ancestors had already adapted to low light living, choosing the night as their domain long before the asteroid struck. While the dinosaurs basked in the warmth of daylight, early mammals crept through the shadows, hunting insects, sniffing out roots, navigating forests under moonlight. This nocturnal lifestyle gave them a surprising advantage when the skies darkened and the sun's warmth grew faint. While other creatures struggled in a dimmed world, mammals were already experts at surviving in the dark. Their warm bloodedness, a biological trait called endothermy, meant that mammals could regulate their internal temperature regardless of the changing climate around them. When global temperatures plummeted after the impact, many cold blooded animals faltered, becoming sluggish or immobile as their bodies cooled. But mammals generated their own heat, whether hiding underground or foraging in freezing conditions. Their fur covered bodies kept them warm enough to move, to eat, and most importantly, to reproduce. And they didn't need much to keep going. And most mammals at the time were small bodied, not much larger than a mouse or a rat. They didn't need vast quantities of food, nor did they rely on complex food chains. Many had omnivorous diets, meaning they could eat a wide range of things: insects, seeds, carrion, roots. In a shattered world where the rules of life had suddenly changed, this flexibility was a key to survival. Mammals could scavenge from what remained, digesting what others couldn't. Some dug deep burrows, carving homes beneath the ruined surface. Underground, they were protected from wildfires, acid rain, and radiation. These safe pockets became tiny sanctuaries, places where life could quietly regroup, shielded from the fury above. Inside these hidden tunnels, mothers could nurse their young, and families could huddle together through the worst nights of Earth's long recovery. Beyond just enduring, mammals carried within them a blueprint for resilience. Their reproductive strategies, fewer offspring but better care for each, meant that even in small numbers, populations could rebuild. Their social behaviors allowed them to teach, learn, and adapt faster. Their sensory adaptations, from whiskers that felt the ground to ears tuned for rustles in the dark, kept them alert to even the faintest signs of danger or opportunity. And while evolution never plans ahead, it seemed as though mammals had been preparing all along. The extinction had cleared a path, but mammals didn't just fill a vacuum, they brought new potential with them. Freed from the towering shadows of the dinosaurs, they began to expand into roles no one had held before. Some grew larger, some returned to the trees, others ventured into rivers or learned to run swiftly across open plains. Over millions of years, their forms would diversify in stunning ways. From simple beginnings, they would branch into predators, grazers, climbers, and diggers. Fur would take new colors and shapes. Limbs would stretch, shorten, specialize. Brains would grow. And somewhere, among all those scattered experiments, a few lines began to curve towards something new, something that could think deeply, walk upright, and speak in stories. The quiet endurance of those tiny mammals wasn't just a lucky twist in the fossil record, it was the first heartbeat of a future that included primates, and much later, us. What began in darkness with creatures clinging to life in burrows and shadows would one day rise into light, and in time, those same traits that had once merely helped mammals survive would become the foundations of intelligence, society, and eventually civilization. But before that story could unfold, Earth had more tests in store, because even as mammals began their climb, the planet itself kept shifting beneath them, ready to remind every living thing that life here has always danced between creation and collapse. The rise of mammals set the stage for new stories to be written across the earth, each one etched in the branching limbs of evolution. Some of those branches led to primates, others to great apes, and eventually one thin thread wove its way to us: Homo sapiens, the storytellers, the builders, the fire bearers. Life, after surviving 5 cataclysms, had birthed a species capable of reflection, innovation, and destruction. Unlike the asteroid that struck 66 million years ago, or the supervolcanoes that poisoned the sky during the Permian, this new extinction is not from the sky or the deep mantle. It's coming from within our own hands. Li- Without sounding any alarms, it quietly began. Forests were cleared, not by lava but by machines. Trees fell not in firestorms, but to the steady rhythm of chainsaws. The dense, breathing jungles that once cradled thousands of unique species became farmland, highways, suburbs. Bit by bit, the natural world shrank as species lost the places they called home. Habitat loss is now one of the most immediate pressures crushing biodiversity, an invisible wave pushing countless creatures toward silence. But it's not just about the land. Oceans, once vast, mysterious sanctuaries of life, have been warming. Coral reefs bleach under stress. Acidifying waters, caused by excess carbon dioxide, dissolve the very shells of tiny marine creatures, some of them the base of entire food webs. As the chemistry of seawater shifts, so too does the intricate balance that has supported marine life for millions of years. Fish migrate, plankton vanish, predators go hungry. All of it happens gradually. But that's the danger, because we still think we have time. Scientists have compared today's extinction rate to what's called the background rate, the normal natural pace at which species disappear due to evolution and change. Right now, extinction is occurring at least 100 to 1,000 times faster than that background rate. Entire lineages are disappearing faster than they can even be discovered. Some biologists believe we're losing dozens of species every single day. And unlike the big five extinctions, which were triggered by forces beyond life's control, this one is different. It's not a comet or volcano this time. It's consumption, it's pollution, it's overfishing, poaching, deforestation, and the unchecked spread of industrial civilization. The sixth extinction isn't a single event, it's a slow unraveling, a long, steady pulse that's picking up speed. Still, even in this deep uncertainty, there's a flicker of something we haven't seen in previous extinctions: awareness. No trilobite or dinosaur ever saw their end coming, but we can. We can name it, chart it, measure its rise, and with that awareness comes a question as sharp as any asteroid's edge: is it reversible? The answer isn't simple. Some damage is permanent. Lost species don't come back. Ancient forests take centuries to return if they ever do. Coral reefs can't be rebuilt like cities. But we're not powerless. The same tools that brought us to the brink, technology, communication, science, can also be turned toward restoration. Protected areas, wildlife corridors, rewilding efforts, renewable energy, carbon capture, sustainable agriculture, all of these are real tools, but tools are only as powerful as the hands that wield them. So the deeper question becomes, what role do we choose to play? Are we the asteroid or the survivors? Are we the architects of collapse or the stewards of renewal? Unlike the species that vanished in silence, we have voices. Unlike the earth shaping volcanoes, we have choices. And with every passing year, the window for those choices narrows. The irony is painful. We are the first species capable of studying extinction in real time, and the first to be able to prevent one. But to do so means looking beyond our own lives, beyond quarterly profits or political cycles. It means thinking like the planet again, long term, interconnected with reverence for the fragile systems that hold everything up. And this brings us to a strange place in Earth's story. one where the line between destroyer and creator blurs. Because if we are the cause, then we might also be the cure. The sixth extinction is not just a moment of collapse, it is also a test, one that asks whether evolution, in creating us, has also created a species wise enough to stop itself from unraveling the very web it depends on. But even as we search for that wisdom, the world keeps turning. Skies warm, glaciers melt, species disappear before they are even named, and the earth, still breathing, still remembering, waits for our answer. Across the vast stretch of time, life has endured blow after blow, bending without fully breaking. When meteors fell, when volcanoes roared, when oceans turned toxic and skies went dark, the earth found ways to recover. Not always quickly, and never without scars, but always with something new. Somewhere in those ruins, patterns began to take shape, and if we look closely, we can see them still. Each extinction left behind a kind of signature, a pattern not just of what disappeared, but of what persisted and how life adapted. These were not random wipeouts. They followed rhythms. First came a disruption, sudden or slow, then the collapse of systems too finely balanced to withstand it. Food chains unraveled, niches vanished, species fell like dominoes, often starting with the most specialized. But then something else always stirred in the silence: renewal. That cycle collapse, vacancy, rebound is nature's brutal reset button. After each mass extinction, the survivors weren't necessarily the strongest, but often the most adaptable. The generalists, the small, the ones able to thrive on scraps, to tolerate extremes, to change when the world around them did. These were the seeds of the next chapter. But not every ecosystem broke in the same way. Some fragmented immediately, others held out until stressors became too much. This difference reveals a hidden trait that has echoed across time. Resilience isn't about being unbreakable, it's about having room to absorb the blow. And that room often comes from diversity. When a web of life is built with many threads, many species, many roles, it can flex when disturbed. If one species disappears, another may step in to fill its place. But when that web is thin, with only a few key players holding everything together, the collapse comes faster and hits harder. The fossil record shows this again and again. Ecosystems with high biodiversity buffered against extinction longer and rebounded more quickly after the worst passed. Diversity isn't just beauty or curiosity, it's protection. Even in Earth's darkest moments, there were always places where life clung on: deep sea vents, forested valleys, shaded burrows, sheltered reefs, refugia where the chaos couldn't fully reach. These patches served as lifeboats, preserving genetic variety and essential functions that would later repopulate the world. Resilience often began in quiet corners. Over time, these hidden survivors shaped the world anew. Amphibians crawled from freshwater pockets after the Permian extinction. Early mammals endured in the shadows of dinosaurs. Birds, distant cousins of the very reptiles that fell from the sky, took to the air after the asteroid. And always evolution got to work again, not starting over, but starting from what remained. That's the lesson carved into every layer of stone and fossil. Life does not stop, but it does change. It loses and rebuilds. And those that build best are not necessarily the biggest or boldest, but the most versatile. When environments shift, when climates swing, when old systems crumble, diversity is the engine of survival. This matters now more than ever, because today, as extinctions rise again, not from asteroids or magma, but from chainsaws, smokestacks, and oil rigs, We face a mirror. Are we reducing the Earth's options? Are we narrowing the path life can take forward? The fewer species that exist, the more fragile our systems become. Agriculture, medicine, clean water, stable climate. These depend on a diversity of organisms and relationships too complex to fully understand. Once gone, some cannot be rebuilt. The past shows us that collapse is not always total, and that life does come back, but it takes millions of years. We do not have that kind of time, and this time we are part of the web being tested. The lesson from all those fallen worlds isn't just about biology, it's about choices. Every extinction paved the way for something new, but the cost was staggering. With knowledge, we can choose differently. We can learn to preserve complexity, to value smallness and flexibility, to listen to the early signals of strain. Because what Earth has endured before, it could endure again, but the shape of what comes next depends on how much we let fall away. When towering beasts vanished and grand ecosystems fell silent, something always lingered. Not the giants, not the rulers of their age, but the quiet ones, the ones who scurried through the cracks, slipped unnoticed beneath the waves, or burrowed deep into the earth. They weren't strong in the traditional sense. They weren't kings of their food chains, yet they endured, and when the world rebuilt itself, it was often these small, simple creatures that formed the foundation of life's next act. Survival, it seems, doesn't always belong to the bold. More often, it belongs to the adaptable. Generalist species, those able to live in many places, eat many foods, and tolerate a wide range of conditions, have always fared better during times of upheaval. Unlike specialists who rely on narrow diets, specific habitats, or delicate relationships, generalists are nature's improvisers. When conditions shift, they shift too. When food disappears in one form, they find another. Their strength is flexibility, not dominance. Throughout every extinction event, from the ancient seas of the Ordovician to the asteroid scarred Earth of the Cretaceous, one pattern repeats. Creatures with broad tolerances tend to survive. This isn't just about biology, it's about geography, reproduction, and timing. Generalists often have wide distribution. They live across continents or oceans, not just one corner of the world. That makes them harder to wipe out in one blow. They also reproduce quickly. While a single large animal might raise a few offspring slowly, generalists often flood the environment with thousands. Even if only a few survive, that's enough to keep the lineage going. In the chaos of mass extinction, numbers matter. And then there's simplicity. Complex, highly evolved systems are impressive until they're disrupted. Simple organisms like bacteria or algae can tolerate changes in temperature, oxygen, acidity, and light. They can hibernate, go dormant, or shift metabolisms altogether. These aren't signs of weakness, they're signs of ancient strength. Looking back, trilobites once ruled the seafloor with countless species, but many were highly specialized. Some adapted to specific depths, others to exact salinity or sediment types. When their environment changed, most couldn't adjust. They disappeared. Meanwhile, hardy mollusks and simple filter feeders survived and spread. Later, during the Permian catastrophe, coral reefs then formed by entirely different species than today collapsed entirely. The reefs depended on tight symbioses and stable water chemistry. When oceans warmed and turned acidic, those links shattered. Yet burrowing worms, crustaceans, and microbial mats found ways to carry on. Even among vertebrates, this pattern holds. Small bodied reptiles, amphibians, and insectivorous mammals made it through fire and famine. Some lived in underground dens, Others emerged only at night. They didn't need much, and needing less became the key to having more time. Contrast that with creatures at the top of food chains. Apex predators often have low population numbers and large home ranges. They depend on the presence of prey and intact ecosystems. When extinction cascades begin, they're among the first to vanish. Large size, slow reproduction, and ecological dependency become liabilities. This doesn't mean nature punishes complexity. It just means that when disaster strikes, survival favors those with fewer dependencies. Being small, being simple, and being everywhere means having more options. And in a collapsing world, options are everything. The fossil record shows that species with wider ecological footprints, those found in multiple habitats across different regions, persisted longer through extinction events. This is true for ancient brachiopods, for ammonites, even for early mammals. It's as if nature scattered her bets, and the ones that didn't stay in one place were the most likely to be cashed in later. Some species survived simply because they were hard to kill, not because of armor or strength, but because of invisibility. They were underfoot, unseen, unbothered. Their humble roles, decomposers, grazers, scavengers, turned out to be essential. After every extinction, it was these survivors that helped rebuild soil, clean water, and restart nutrient cycles. Without them, recovery wouldn't just be slow, it might never begin. Even today, as pressures mount once more, we see the same dynamics playing out. Urban pigeons, rats, cockroaches, jellyfish, and microbes flourish in disturbed environments, not because they're superior, but because they can thrive in chaos. They don't require pristine wilderness. They persist in sewers, in deserts, in garbage. They are living proof that resilience isn't always beautiful, but it is effective. This is the uncomfortable truth written across geologic time. The grandest species are often the most fragile. Survival doesn't favor the dominant, it favors the flexible. And as we edge deeper into uncertainty, that quiet lesson from the past becomes harder to ignore. Even when the surface of the earth seems shattered, when firestorms rage, oceans turn black, and skies fill with ash, life still clings to existence in places most would never think to look. In the aftermath of every extinction, something always survives, not just in the forests or oceans, but in the unlikeliest corners of the planet. It's here, in these extreme forgotten places, that we find Earth's greatest survivors, the ones that refuse to die. They are called extremophiles, and they don't follow the usual rules of biology. These tiny life forms flourish in environments so harsh, most other organisms would be instantly destroyed. Imagine boiling water erupting from deep sea hydrothermal vents where temperatures soar past 400 degrees Celsius. The pressure would crush a submarine, yet some microbes not only live there, they thrive using heat and chemicals to power their tiny metabolisms. Move to the other extreme, and you'll find others locked in Arctic ice, alive but frozen. Some of these bacteria haven't stirred in tens of thousands of years, yet they still hold the ability to awaken. In salty underground lakes beneath Antarctica, where light never reaches and the cold is paralyzing, life hums quietly along. These microbes don't photosynthesize, they survive on chemistry, breaking down minerals and gases in complete darkness, patiently waiting, sometimes for millennia. Then there are acid pools where pH levels drop lower than battery acid, or radioactive zones where DNA is bombarded with damaging rays. Still, certain species persist, repairing their own cells faster than they're torn apart. These aren't just freaks of nature. They're reminders that life isn't fragile, it's incredibly resourceful. Among these hardy survivors is perhaps the most famous, the tardigrade, also known as the water bear. Barely the size of a grain of sand, it looks like a slow moving microscopic caterpillar. But don't let its tiny, pudgy frame fool you. Tardigrades are among the toughest animals on the planet. They can survive being boiled, frozen, dried out, blasted with radiation, and even launched into the vacuum of space and still come back to life. When conditions get bad, they curl into a dried husk called a tun, reducing their metabolism to near zero. In this state, they can wait out disaster, years, decades, maybe more. And when water returns, so do they. Deep beneath the ocean floor, microbes live in rocks, feeding on chemical traces so faint we once thought life couldn't survive that deep. These life forms don't care about sunlight or seasons, they operate on timescales we can barely comprehend. Their cycles are measured in thousands of years, but they endure slowly, silently. Even fungal spores, seemingly asleep, can last through radiation bursts, vacuum exposure, and temperature swings. Some have been recovered from ancient amber or permafrost, revived after being buried for millions of years. It's as if Earth has built in backup copies, tiny instructions on how to rebuild, scattered and hidden, waiting patiently for the right conditions to start again. All of this points to a quiet truth. Where death seems to reign, life still lingers. It may shrink, hide, or slow to a near stop, but it doesn't give up. That astonishing flexibility is written into life's design. Evolution doesn't only favor the strong or the fast, it often favors the patient, the adaptable, the invisible. When global systems fail and giants fall, these microscopic beings remain behind, holding the threads of the next chapter. It was like this during the Permian extinction, during the Chicxulub impact, and even now, deep in our changing oceans and warming soils. There is something profoundly humbling about this. It reminds us that life isn't bound to what's visible. It doesn't depend on our comforts, our temperatures, our oxygen. It doesn't even need sunlight. The ingredients for survival are far more flexible than we once believed. And if life can persist at the bottom of volcanic oceans, or locked in Antarctic saltwater, or drifting through the upper atmosphere in clouds of dust, then perhaps the story of Earth isn't just one of destruction, it's one of relentless persistence. Because when everything falls apart, when ecosystems vanish and the world seems empty, life isn't gone, it's just waiting. When a species disappears, when entire ecosystems collapse, it can feel like a final page turning, an irreversible loss. And in many ways it is. The sounds those creatures made, the ways they moved through their environments, the roles they played in ancient food webs, those vanish. But evolution doesn't stop at the edge of extinction. In fact, it often begins again there, using the ashes of what came before as fertile ground for what's next. Extinction doesn't just remove, it clears. Like a wildfire burning through a dense forest, it strips away what once dominated, making room for light to reach the soil again. New things can sprout where old giants once stood. Evolution doesn't view death as a failure, it treats it as space, a pause that allows creativity to rise. This isn't just poetic thinking, it's how life has always worked. Evolution is a process of trial and error, but it's shaped by limits, by who's already occupying the world. When an environment is full of dominant species, smaller, stranger ones often stay in the shadows. But when a massive extinction wipes the slate partly clean, the rules change. The hidden survivors suddenly find open sky above them. No predators, no competition, no towering giants shading them out. And in that window, evolution innovates. And It's like opening up a stalled computer, clearing out the old code, and letting the system rewrite itself. Not perfectly, not immediately, but differently, sometimes beautifully. After the Ordovician extinction, survivors developed tougher shells and new body structures. They'd never had the chance to before. There wasn't room. After the Permian-Triassic event, the most catastrophic in Earth's history, new forms of life emerged that had never existed. Ancestors of modern reptiles, the first true archosaurs, even early mammals. All of it came not in spite of the collapse, but because of it. This cycle repeats again and again. With every mass extinction, Earth doesn't stop, it reboots. Evolution doesn't rebuild what was lost. It doesn't look backward. Instead, it pushes forward, testing combinations that weren't viable before. Ecosystems don't return to their previous state. They transform into something entirely new. New ecosystems, new roles, new rules, new rules. Take the dinosaurs. Their rise wasn't a slow climb over older competitors. It was a leap through an open door left behind by the Triassic extinction. Upright posture, faster movement, better lungs. They had traits that gave them an edge in a world recovering from chaos. And because of the gap left behind, they flourished. Then their own end came suddenly, violently. The asteroid crash wiped out nearly all large animals, but small mammals, already adapted to life in the margins, took that moment to grow, to spread, to diversify. Within a few million years, they had reshaped the planet. It's tempting to think of extinction as a downward spiral, but evolution treats it like a reset button. A terrible one, a costly one, but still one that makes room for something new. What's even more fascinating is that many of the most successful adaptations in history only became dominant after a major extinction. Feathers, flowering plants, internal gestation, all of these transformative changes expanded only after Earth had emptied out space for them to grow into. And this isn't limited to grand creatures or towering trees. Even at the microbial level, extinction forces flexibility. When conditions shift, when oxygen vanishes or heat rises, microbes that were once sidelined become the architects of the next era. They start building again from the cellular level up. This pattern tells us something subtle but powerful. Evolution doesn't fear endings, it adapts to them. It doesn't fight to restore what was, it works with what remains. That resilience is why life keeps returning, even when the odds seem impossible. It's not just survival, it's reinvention. Each extinction has left behind not only fossils, but blueprints, traces of what worked and what failed. Genetic echoes, environmental scars, clues, and each time Earth has listened, not by repeating itself, but by reshaping itself into something more complex, more interconnected, more prepared for the next shock. Now, with humanity in the picture, we stand at a strange crossroad. We are part of evolution's story, but also its disruptors. And yet, even now, the same force that shaped trilobites and trees is still working, quietly, patiently, with every generation that passes. Because extinction isn't the end, it's just the beginning of something we haven't seen yet. If we pull the camera back far enough past the bones in the dirt, past the craters and volcanoes, even past the rise and fall of entire kingdoms of life, something strange begins to emerge. A rhythm, not a neat, predictable beat, but a pattern all the same. Earth doesn't just live in a straight line, it pulses, expands, contracts, breathes in and out, over scales so vast we only recognize the motion, by tracing scars left across the crust of time. Life blooms, then something shakes the planet, erupts, crashes, shifts, and everything collapses. But then always comes the rebuilding, and with it, a new version of life, shaped by what just happened. It's not random, it's not steady either. It's a chaotic rhythm, one of boom, collapse, rebirth. This cycle isn't limited to biology, it's built into the rock itself. Tectonic plates grind and drift across molten currents. Continents merge and split. Oceans vanish and return. Mountains rise slowly, only to be eroded grain by grain into plains. The planet reshapes itself with the same ruthless creativity that governs evolution. Entire habitats are created and destroyed just by the silent motion of Earth's crust shifting beneath our feet. And climate, too, follows long, slow loops. Ice ages advancing like glaciers over eons, then retreating as warmth returns. Earth's tilt, its orbit, even its wobble, all play a role in these deep time weather patterns. Deserts become wetlands, lush jungles freeze, the atmosphere thickens, thins, breathes carbon, exhales oxygen. Then, occasionally, something comes from beyond. A comet or asteroid, a sudden bolt from the cosmic dark, crashes into this careful dance and rewrites everything. These aren't common, but they don't need to be. One impact can shift the course of millions of years. They remind us that Earth isn't spinning alone, it's part of a solar system, one whose own rhythm we're only beginning to understand. Even cosmic radiation, solar flares, and gamma ray bursts may have played roles in shaping biology on Earth, altering DNA silently across generations, or triggering subtle changes that ripple through ecosystems. We're living on a planet, yes, but also riding through a galaxy that never stops moving. And inside all of these layers, rock, water, sky, space, life continues to follow its own tune. It's always responding to the conditions it's given. When stability lasts long enough, complexity increases, ecosystems get richer, forests deepen, coral reefs sprawl like underwater cities, wings evolve, brains grow, and then something shifts. Whether it's volcanoes pouring out carbon for a million years, or ocean currents flipping, or land plants reshaping the carbon cycle, it doesn't matter. Eventually, the balance tips. What once thrived begins to falter. Species vanish, food webs unravel, and Earth begins again. The shocking part is not that this happens, but that it keeps happening, and life keeps returning, changed but unbroken. The same pattern repeats, not in a circle, but in spirals, each time a little different, each collapse followed not by the same old forms, but new ones, more intricate, more adaptive, more suited to what the world has become. The Permian extinction didn't just destroy, it opened space for dinosaurs. The end of the dinosaurs didn't just mark loss, it set the stage for mammals. And now, with humans reshaping the planet in ways no other species has before, the next pattern may be forming. Whether it includes us or not remains to be seen. But if Earth's history is any guide, the planet will recover. It always does. Zooming out even further, the Earth itself won't last forever. One day, the sun will swell and change. One day, the continents may merge into a single landmass again, only to pull apart once more. The moon is slowly drifting away. The atmosphere is evolving. Even time itself on Earth is measured by shifts so massive we barely register them. And still, amid all that, life continues. Sometimes fragile, sometimes fierce, always adjusting. These cycles remind us that change isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system An extinction, as terrible as it is, isn't an end carved in stone. It's a phase, a reset, a rebalancing. What comes next is shaped by what disappears and by what manages, somehow, to hold on. Because in the rhythm of Earth, nothing is permanent. Not the creatures that roam its surface, not the oceans or forests, not even extinction itself. Just movement, just rhythm, boom, collapse, rebirth, and the next beat is already on its way. The earth today feels calm, at least on the surface. The forests still breathe, the oceans still move to the rhythm of the moon, birds still rise with the morning light. But beneath this quiet, something is shifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it isn't. Our atmosphere is warming. Ice that stood unmoved for tens of thousands of years now melts in seasonal waves. Coral reefs, once bustling underwater cities, are bleaching white, silent casualties of temperature shifts too fast for them to endure. Forests are retreating, rivers are thinning, and species vanish without headlines, each loss a thread pulled from the intricate web we depend on. It's not one single event that's changing our world, it's a mosaic of patterns playing out across continents and oceans. Greenhouse gases, long buried in fossil fuels, are now building in the sky at levels unseen in millions of years. Methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, all invisible but powerful enough to alter jet streams, ocean currents, and the boundaries of entire biomes. But more than the numbers, it's the signals that whisper the truth. Permafrost softens, releasing ancient gases. Once reliable monsoons stall or surge. Insects shift their ranges. Plants bloom out of season. These are Earth's early warnings, not shouted but murmured, if we choose to hear them. And yet, this isn't a story of fear, it's one of awareness. And because Earth, through all its deep time cycles, has never been frozen in place. What makes now different is the speed. Nature builds change in centuries. We're doing it in decades. And still, there is time, but it's borrowed, on loan from the future. Tipping points loom like thresholds in the dark. A rainforest once crossed may not return. An ice sheet once melted may not reform. These are the points of no return, not because they mark an explosion, but because they set off slow spirals that unfold across generations. The challenge is not to panic, but to pause, to realize that this moment we're living in, a moment of relative balance, isn't guaranteed. It is precious precisely because it is temporary and fragile, like the last frost before spring, like the breath held between two notes in a song. It's the kind of stillness that doesn't last. We live in the in between, between the last mass extinction and whatever comes next, between abundance and collapse, between ignorance and wisdom, and how we act in this sliver of time could echo far beyond us. It begins with how we see the world, not as something separate from ourselves, but as something we are deeply woven into. The air we breathe is ancient, shared by trees and whales and clouds. The water we drink is recycled through time, from mountain snow to ocean mist, to the tears in our own eyes. We are part of the Earth's story, not just watching from the sidelines. To live wisely now means stepping softly, not with guilt, but with reverence. It means designing systems that give back as much as they take. It means listening, not just to data, but to what the land is telling us. And sometimes it means doing less, letting wild things be wild, letting rivers find their old paths, letting silence return where noise has taken over. Borrowed time is not the end of the road, it's the edge of choice. We can still decide about how much we consume, about how we build, about what we protect, and about what kind of ancestors we want to be. Because life doesn't stop. Even if we falter, the planet will continue. The sun will still rise. Microbes will still multiply. Forests may regrow in strange new forms. Birds may sing a different tune. Life will adapt as it always has. But the version of Earth we love, the one that fed us, taught us, and held our stories, that one needs us now. So we stand at the edge of deep time, holding a flame passed down through millions of years, a flame kept alive by fish that swam through anoxic seas, by mammals that burrowed through firestorms, by humans who crossed frozen continents. It's our turn to carry it, not forever, just for now. Because this moment, right here, right now, is more than just time passing. It's borrowed, and borrowed time deserves to be honored. If Earth has taught us anything, it's that survival doesn't always belong to the biggest, the smartest, or the most powerful. It often belongs to the quiet, the overlooked, the things that hide in the cracks. And so when we ask what might survive us, we have to look downward, into the soil, into the shadows, into the smallest forms of life that have long outlasted giants. Start with the rats. They scurry through our cities, squeezing through narrow spaces, surviving off our leftovers. Their teeth never stop growing, their senses are sharp, they're smart, social, and astonishingly adaptable. If humanity fades, cities may crumble into dust, but the rats won't notice. They'll burrow deeper, build their own networks, and thrive on whatever remains. Then there are the cockroaches, symbols of resilience for good reason. They've seen millions of years pass and made it through disasters that erased other species entirely. They can survive without food for weeks, hold their breath for minutes, and live without a head for a while. Heat doesn't scare them. Radiation barely affects them. In a world reshaped by catastrophe, cockroaches would simply keep crawling forward. But perhaps the real champions of survival are even smaller. Microbes, fungi, bacteria. They live in boiling vents at the bottom of the ocean. They cling to rocks miles beneath the ground. They drift through the clouds and sleep inside ice. Some can lie dormant for centuries waiting. Others feed on metal, plastic, or radiation. These life forms don't need light. They don't need comfort. They just need chemistry. And Earth has plenty of that. One of them might even be reborn after we're gone. Fungi, in particular, have a strange sort of patience. Some weave themselves through forests, forming underground networks that carry signals between trees. Others feed on decay. If human civilization were to collapse, buildings falling, machines rusting, fields turning to ash, it might be fungi that come next, slowly digesting the leftovers, turning concrete into compost, reminding the planet how to start again. And then there's the question we don't yet know how to answer. What if it isn't biology that survives us? What if something we created keeps going? Artificial intelligence machines that learn, adapt, maybe even decide. They already inhabit our homes and servers. They monitor weather patterns, translate languages, suggest music. But what happens if their creators vanish? If the world goes quiet, but the code keeps running? A lonely satellite could orbit overhead, still pinging signals to a dead Earth. A data center in the Arctic, powered by wind or sun, might continue to hum long after the people who built it are gone. Would it try to rebuild? Would it even know that anything was lost? Or would it simply observe, like a memory, with no one to recall it? Some scientists imagine synthetic life, organisms built from scratch, not born from evolution. tiny molecular machines that repair themselves, replicate, maybe even adapt. If they ever escape the lab and find their place in the wild, they could become Earth's next architects. Not plants or animals, but something entirely new, carried forward not by DNA, but by design. And in the silence that might follow humanity, Earth will keep moving, the sun will rise, the tides will shift, rain will fall, volcanoes will rumble. In time, something, someone, or something will fill the space we once occupied. It might be small, it might not even notice us, but it will live. And somewhere beneath layers of dust and stone, our traces will remain. A fossilized tooth, a plastic bottle, a piece of code buried in a circuit board, a forgotten structure wrapped in moss. These will be our echoes. Whether the next inheritor of Earth is a scuttling insect, a microscopic spore, a curious AI, or something we cannot yet imagine, one truth will hold. Life wants to continue, not in the way we know it, not with memory or ambition, but with persistence, with rhythm, with change. And so, Earth will carry forward, not because we were here, but because it always has. Because survival, in the end, belongs not to those who ruled, but to those who remained. Maybe extinction isn't the end, maybe it's a beginning. After everything the planet has endured, shattered continents, poisoned skies, frozen oceans, burning forests, it's never truly stopped. Not once. Earth has cracked open, shaken itself, turned dark, and then started over, again and again. It doesn't mourn in the way we do, it resets, and from that emptiness, something new always rises. We often see time as a straight path, past, present, future. But Earth's time isn't linear. It breathes in great slow cycles, growth, collapse, rebirth, over and over. What seems like ruin is sometimes just a pause, a clearing, a space for something else to emerge. And here we are now, a flicker in Earth's long breath, a brief chapter in a story that spans billions of years. The rocks beneath our feet have witnessed worlds we can only imagine, forests of tree-sized ferns, oceans filled with creatures that glow in the dark, skies once painted orange with methane, then blue with oxygen, and at times nearly black with ash. Mountains have risen and vanished, rivers have run dry and returned in new places, stars above us have blinked out and been replaced. Through it all, Earth has never stopped becoming. We're part of that becoming, not rulers, not passengers, but participants in a moment, just one moment in a much longer unfolding. Sometimes that thought feels heavy, fragile, like the world could slip through our fingers, but it can also feel freeing, because if Earth has always begun again, then so can we. When the world feels uncertain, when the news feels like a countdown, when we wonder what's next, or if it's too late, that's when this story matters most, because it reminds us endings are part of the pattern and beginnings hide inside them. The question isn't just what will survive us, it's what we'll choose while we're here, how we'll treat this delicate balance, what stories we'll leave behind, not just in plastic and steel, but in how we cared, how we helped, how we listened. Some creatures survive because they adapt, others because they move. A few simply wait, but the ones that thrive, they stay connected to the soil, to each other, to the changing world around them. Maybe our survival, too, depends on reconnecting, not just with nature, but with scale, with time, with awe. Because when you look up at the stars and realize you're standing on a planet that survived 5 mass extinctions, and you are part of its sixth, something shifts. You begin to notice the quiet, and you begin to listen differently. And in that silence, there's a kind of peace, not the peace of perfection, or answers, or control, but the peace of being small in something vast, the comfort of being a breath in Earth's long exhale, the humility to know we are not the center, but we are not separate either. And if Earth has kept going, then maybe, just maybe, we are not at the end. Maybe this too is a transition, a moment of pause, pure, a space being made, and somewhere inside it, a seed of what's next is already waiting. So if you felt the quiet weight of the world lately, let this be a gentle reminder. We are not alone in uncertainty. Every forest that burned, every ocean that went silent, every species that vanished, it all left something behind, a trace, a lesson, a chance, and we are living inside those chances now. So maybe Earth isn't asking us to be perfect. Maybe it's just asking us to participate, to notice, to care, to create something worthy of the time we've been given. If this journey has stirred something in you, if it made you wonder or reflect or simply slow down, then I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more quiet adventures through science, history, and the strange beauty of the natural world. There's so much more to explore. And if you know someone who would love to hear this story, share it with them. Let's keep wondering together, because Earth keeps starting over. And maybe that means so can we.